The cloak smelled of tallow and damp wool, and it hung from Marjorie Neville's shoulders as though it had never belonged to anyone of consequence, which was precisely the point. She had taken it from the peg beside the scullery door that morning, in the half-dark before the household woke, while the single candle on the kitchen table threw shadows long enough to hide in. The cloak was brown and shapeless, the sort of garment that made its wearer invisible by design, worn smooth at the elbows and fraying at the hem where it had caught on stone floors for some previous occupant's years of service. Marjorie pulled the hood forward until it sat low above her brow, and then she walked, quietly, through the servants' passage and into the cold October morning, and the 2 guards stationed at the rear gate of Thornfield Hall looked past her, without pause, as they had looked past servants for the whole of their posting. What waited for her at the other end of the village lane was a magistrate's hearing, her name on the list, her father's debts on a ledger, and her cousin Aldous Neville's voice, polished with certainty, ready to argue before Sir Eldred Hawke that she had misappropriated the Neville estate accounts before her father's death, that she had stolen what she had only ever tried to preserve, that a woman who kept her own books was a woman who cooked them. She had not been invited to attend. That was the cruelty of it. Courteous and complete. The hearing would proceed without her. Aldous had informed her through his solicitor's letter, as she was not a party to the legal action, merely its subject. And so she had made herself uninvited in the other direction, which was the only honest response she could find. The lane was empty at this hour. Her breath showed in the cold air. She did not know that anyone had watched her go. Marjorie Constance Neville was 24 years old and had been managing the Thornfield accounts since she was 19, first under her father's eye, and then, after his long decline began, under her own steady hand. The estate was not large. 700 acres of farmland and wood, a respectable house, tenants whose rents were the only reliable income since her father's investments had, over 15 years, been dismantled by the quiet catastrophe of his fondness for promising ventures and his complete disregard for their outcomes. What Marjorie had inherited on his death was not comfort. It was a set of account ledgers in which every entry had been scrupulously kept, every debt carefully ordered, every tenant's situation noted in her own hand, and a cousin who had arrived within a fortnight of the funeral with a solicitor at his side, and a claim that, as the only male heir, the estate and everything in it now belonged to him. She had not disputed the entail. The entail was what the entail was, and disputing it would have cost her the last of her dignity and accomplished nothing. What she had disputed was Aldous' characterization of the 3 years she had held the accounts, his insistence that certain transfers she had made to shore up the tenant fund and pay down the most pressing creditor debts represented not good management, but misuse of property. That was, he claimed, already his by right of expectation. She disputed it, and he had gone to Sir Eldred. The village of Ashwick Crossing was not large. The magistrates' hall was on the High Street, a solid stone building with 2 windows facing the lane and a door that opened inward, which Marjorie had reason to notice, because she walked through it at 8:30 in the morning, still in the brown cloak, still wearing the servant's posture she had borrowed with it, and found a seat in the back corner of the public gallery before anyone thought to look at her twice. The hall was not full, but it was not empty either. There were perhaps 30 people in the gallery, some of whom Marjorie recognized. Tenants from the Thornfield farms, the solicitor her father had trusted before his death, Aldous' 2 friends from the county, and in the front row of the gallery on the opposite side, a man she had not expected. She had expected to think about him less by now. She had been wrong. The Earl of Harwick sat with his hands resting open on his knees, his coat a deep charcoal wool rather than the navy she had seen him wear at the harvest assembly 3 weeks earlier, and he was watching the magistrate's table with an attention that did not waver when the door opened and closed, or when Aldous' solicitor shuffled papers. Richard Calloway. The Earl of Harwick was 36 years old, and had held the title for 4 years, since the death of his elder brother, and in the 4 years she had known him by name and by sight, Marjorie had formed an exact understanding of the distance between his world and hers, which was the distance between a man who owned 12,000 acres in 2 counties and a woman who had been trying, with patience and considerable arithmetic, to save 700. She did not understand why he was here. The hearing opened without ceremony. Sir Eldred Hawke was a compact man of 60, precise and humorless, who had served as magistrate in Ashwick for 20 years, and who conducted the proceeding with the careful neutrality of a man who found sentiment inconvenient. Aldous Neville was permitted to speak first. He spoke for some time. He cited figures from the accounts, figures Marjorie had entered with her own pen, and characterized them as evidence of her having used estate funds for purposes she had no authority to authorize. He cited the tenant fund disbursements. He cited the payment she had made to Croft, the farrier, in the autumn of the year before her father died, when the horses were needed for the harvest, and Croft's bill had been 2 months overdue. He cited 3 separate transfers made to reduce the mortgage on the lower farmland, each of which Marjorie had recorded in full, with the corresponding creditor receipts filed behind them. He said, in closing, and in a voice of great regret, that his late cousin's daughter was a young woman of uncertain judgment who had confused her own wishes for the estate with the legal right to act upon them. Uncertain judgment. That was the label. She had heard it before, in the solicitor's letter, and now it sat in the stone hall with 30 people around it. Sir Eldred looked up from the ledger that Aldous' solicitor had provided. He looked, by habit, toward the front of the gallery, where he was accustomed to seeing parties to the proceeding. Then, because the woman in the brown cloak in the back corner had been very still for the past 20 minutes, and stillness of that particular quality sometimes signified something, his gaze moved there. He did not know her. She had not given him cause to. What she had not known, sitting in the brown cloak, was that she was not the only person in that room who had arrived through a passage they were not expected to use. The doors at the back of the hall opened at 9:15. 2 footmen in Harwick livery entered, and then the Earl of Harwick rose from his seat in the gallery, crossed the floor with 4 measured steps, and presented himself to Sir Eldred's table with a document in his hand. The room did not know what to do with him. Aldous' solicitor opened his mouth and closed it. Aldous himself turned in his chair with a smile that was designed to appear welcoming and succeeded only in appearing stiff. "My lord," Sir Eldred said, "I have requested the opportunity to present evidence in this matter," the Earl said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "The evidence concerns the state of the Thornfield accounts at the time of Mr. Neville's death, and it was gathered by my steward, at my request, during September of this year." Aldous' solicitor found his voice. "I must object, Sir Eldred, on the grounds that my lord has no standing in this proceeding. I am a landowner in this county," the Earl said, "with interest in the accurate management of estates that border my own, and I have a signed statement from Thomas Ardent, who holds the mortgage on the lower farmland, confirming that the transfers made by Miss Neville reduced the outstanding debt by £430 over 3 years, which is rather more than mere uncertain judgment tends to produce." The hall was very quiet. Marjorie's hands, folded beneath the cloak in her lap, were perfectly still. Her face was composed. Only the pressure of her own fingers against each other told the truth of what she felt, which was something between relief so large it frightened her and a bewilderment she could not yet name. She had not known he was watching. She had not known anyone was. If this moment moves you, stay with it a while. It earns its weight, every measure of it. Her story began long before this room. Marjorie's father, Edward Neville, had been, in his better years, a man of genuine warmth and genuine negligence. He had loved his daughter with the uncomplicated fondness of a man who was glad someone competent was present, had taught her to ride and to play the pianoforte and to read the accounts when she was 15, and had then, with increasing frequency, left the accounts to her while he pursued his ventures. She had loved him, and she had kept his books, and when his health began to fail in the winter of her 21st year, she had sat with him each morning while he was well enough to receive her, and had shown him what she had done with the estate. And he had looked at the numbers and said, in the particular way he had of acknowledging what he would not have thought to do himself, that she had managed it better than he could have. He had meant it as praise. She had taken it as such. What she had not taken it as was permission. Because permission was not his to grant, and had never been the point. The point was that the estate would survive him. It had survived him by 14 months at the time Aldous arrived. The creditors were manageable. The tenants were current. The lower farmland mortgage had been reduced to a balance that could be retired within 7 years on ordinary income. Croft was paid. The household staff had their wages. There was not, at Edward Neville's death, a crisis. Aldous made one. He had arrived with his solicitor and his certainty and his 2 county friends, and he had moved through Thornfield Hall with the practiced ownership of a man who had long privately considered the place his and was now simply completing the formality. He was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders, with fair hair going thin at the crown, and a way of speaking that managed to be simultaneously agreeable and contemptuous. He was not without cleverness. The letter he had sent to his own solicitor 3 months before her father's death, requesting an assessment of the estate's encumbrances, was a piece of clever work, and she had found a copy of it, misfiled among her father's papers, 2 weeks after the funeral. He had been planning before the body was cold. She had shown the letter to no one. She had placed it in the false bottom of the writing box her father had given her when she was 12 years old, the box with the inlaid rosewood panel that opened when you pressed the lower left corner and then the upper right in sequence, and she had kept it there for 8 months while she waited to see what Aldous would do. What he had done was go to Sir Eldred. The Earl of Harwick had lived at Caldmore Park, the Harwick estate, for 11 miles of the same county road that ran past Thornfield, for 4 years. He had been present at the Harvest Assembly in October. He had been present at the assembly before that, in the spring, when Lady Fordham had hosted the subscription ball. And Marjorie had attended in the gown she had worn 3 years running, which was ivory silk with a green sash, and which she wore without apology because it was well made and fit her well, and she had no money to replace it. She had seen him that evening from across the room. She had not expected to be seen in return. He was a man who had learned, or had perhaps always known, to be still. He did not work his way through a room the way some men of his position did, collecting conversations and dispensing attention in measured quantities. He stood where he stood and watched. And what he watched with was the particular quality of attention that takes a person seriously, which is rarer than it has any right to be. He had watched her manage an uncomfortable conversation with Lady Fordham's cousin, a man of considerable self-regard who had been explaining his opinions on the Corn Laws to Marjorie for 4 minutes without pausing long enough to register her expression. She had listened, and then she had said, in the particular voice she reserved for statements that were entirely true and entirely damaging, that his reasoning was interesting, that she had never before heard the argument that tenant farmers should welcome enclosure, and that she would have to think about it. The cousin had not known whether to be offended or not. He had decided not, and had moved away. And Marjorie had turned and found the Earl of Harwick 3 feet from her elbow, looking at the far wall with an expression that was not quite amusement. "I believe," he had said without turning his head, that Mr. Bassett will be troubled by that remark for some time. "I hope so," she had said, and immediately wished she had not, because she did not speak that way to Earls. He had turned and looked at her, full on, for 2 seconds. "As do I," he had said, and walked away. She had thought about it more than was reasonable afterward. She was not in the habit of thinking unreasonably, but she was human. And the Earl of Harwick had a quality of attention that was difficult to dismiss. The second voicing of the label came at Lady Fordham's morning call, 6 weeks after the hearing was announced. Lady Fordham was 62 years old, large-hearted in the specific way that permitted her to be fond of people, while also being entirely comfortable telling them their situation. She sat across the tea table from Marjorie with her cup held in both hands, and said, with genuine sympathy, that it was a shame the matter of the accounts had come to a hearing, because uncertain judgment in a young woman without means was precisely the kind of thing the county talked about. And once the county was talking, it was difficult to be seen as anything other than what the county had decided you were. Marjorie had thanked her for the tea. The third voicing came by report. Marjorie's neighbor, Mrs. Holt, a woman of 45 with a forthright manner and strong opinions about the correct management of everything, called at Thornfield on a Tuesday to inform Marjorie that she had heard from Mr. Aldous himself at the Fordham dinner on Saturday that uncertain judgment was in fact a charitable description of the situation, that his solicitor believed the evidence against Miss Neville was considerable, and that a sensible woman in her position might consider settling quietly rather than forcing a proceeding that would leave her reputation in tatters, regardless of the outcome. Mrs. Holt had delivered this message with the particular energy of a woman who found bad news bracing, and had then looked at Marjorie with the expectation of a collapse that did not come. Marjorie had thanked her for the information, and had poured the tea herself when the girl forgot, and had sent Mrs. Holt out 30 minutes later with a plate of seed cake, and the impression, which was accurate, that Miss Neville did not intend to settle. The morning before the hearing, she had pressed the lower left and upper right corners of the rosewood panel in sequence, and taken out her father's letter. She had not known, walking through the servants' gate in the brown cloak with the letter folded inside her Spencer jacket against her ribs, that the Earl of Harwick's steward had spent September reviewing Thomas Ardent's mortgage records on his employer's instruction. She had not known he was gathering anything. She had thought, if she was honest, that she was going into that hearing alone. Which was why, when he rose from his seat in the gallery and walked to Sir Eldred's table with 4 measured steps and a document in his hand, the breath went out of her so completely that the woman beside her in the gallery, a farm wife from the Thornfield Lower Acres named Mrs. Pemberton, turned to look. Sir Eldred examined the document from the Earl's steward. He examined the mortgage records. He examined Aldis's counter-argument, which became, over the course of the next 20 minutes, less an argument than a series of qualifications delivered in a voice that had lost the certainty of an hour before. Marjorie reached inside her Spencer jacket and withdrew the folded letter. She pressed it flat on her knee. She waited for the correct moment, which was when Sir Eldred asked whether any other evidence was available, and then she stood up in the back corner of the gallery in her brown cloak, and said, in a voice that carried without being raised, that there was one further document he might wish to examine. The room turned. She had not planned for the turning of the room. She had planned only for the document, which she carried to the magistrate's table herself, because no one moved to stop her, perhaps because the Earl of Harwick, who had remained at the front of the hall, was watching with the attention of a man who would notice if anyone tried. She placed the letter on the table. She said in the same steady voice, "This is a letter from my cousin, dated 3 months before my father's death, requesting an assessment of the estate's encumbrances. It was found among my late father's papers." It indicates that the claim against me was contemplated before my father died, and that the characterization of my account management as uncertain judgment served a particular purpose." Sir Eldred read the letter. He read it twice. Aldous said, "I must protest." But the word protest had lost its substance somewhere in the last quarter hour. The Earl had not spoken since his initial presentation. He stood at the side of the hall with his hands at his sides, and watched, and what the watching looked like, to anyone who cared to observe it, was the complete attention of a man who had already decided something and was allowing events to reach their own conclusion. Sir Eldred set the letter down. "Miss Neville," he said, "I am inclined to find the evidence insufficient to support the characterization of misappropriation. The records as presented indicate prudent management of a constrained estate under difficult circumstances. I will make no finding against you in this proceeding." He looked at Aldous. "I trust the matter will be considered closed." Aldous said nothing for a moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man recalculating his position, that he was certain Sir Eldred's judgment was sound. Marjorie took the letter from the magistrate's table, folded it again, and placed it back inside her jacket. Her hands were steady. Her face gave nothing away. The room around her had the particular quality of 30 people exhaling at once, a rustle of wool and released breath, and she stood in the middle of it in the brown cloak that still smelled of tallow, and felt, for the first time in 14 months, the specific sensation of a weight put down. She did not go to the Earl afterward. She had not earned the right, she thought, to go to him, and she was not certain of what she would say if she did. And so she gathered herself and walked back through the hall and out the front door and into the October morning, which was cold and clear and smelled of wood smoke from the village. She was at the end of the lane before she heard his step behind her. She stopped and turned. He had come without his footman, which struck her as deliberate, though she could not have said why. "Miss Neville," he said. "My lord." She waited. He looked at her for a moment, the way he had looked at her at the subscription ball and at the harvest assembly, the way she had told herself she was interpreting incorrectly because a man like the Earl of Harwick did not look at women like Marjorie Neville with any particular meaning. "I heard," he said, "that you came in through the servants' gate." "I was not invited to attend," she said. "No," he said. "You were not." Something moved across his face. "It required some ingenuity, I imagine." "A borrowed cloak," she said. "The guards were not looking at the servants." "No?" he said. "They rarely are." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens between two people who are deciding whether to say what they are actually thinking, and Marjorie had spent 14 months in the company of silences that were not safe, which made this one startling by contrast. "You sent your steward to Ardent in September," she said. "Yes?" "Why?" The question came before she could soften it. He looked at her without looking away, which was his habit, and she felt it in the same place she always did, somewhere below her sternum, the body's inconvenient honesty. "Because," he said, "I have watched you manage an estate that would have failed 3 years ago under ordinary supervision, and I wanted to know if anyone else had noticed." It was not, she understood, a declaration. It was an observation, carefully spoken, from a man who had been watching for longer than she knew. She held it for a moment, the way you hold something that might be fragile. "No one noticed," she said. "I noticed," he said. He had not always been so still. She had come to understand by then, though she could not have explained the understanding precisely. There were rumors, in the county's way, that the Earl of Harwick had been a different sort of man before he became the Earl, more social, more present at the assemblies, the sort of man who was easy in large rooms. His brother had died in the spring of 1815, a riding accident on a wet road near Caldmore Park, and the title had come to Richard Calloway when he was 32 and had not expected it. And the county understood that something had changed in him from that point. Though the county could not have named the change precisely, what had changed was that he had believed, afterward, that he was responsible. He had been the one who suggested the ride. He had been the one who had said the road was passable, though it was raining, because he had wanted his brother's company on a cold afternoon. And Henry had agreed. And they had gone. And Henry had come home over a horse's neck. And Richard had come home on his own feet, and had never, in 4 years, found a way to lay the weight of it down. Marjorie did not know this yet. She would learn it gradually, the way most honest things are learned. Not in a single revelation, but in small accumulations. A word he did not say. A portrait turned away from the light in the Caldmore study. A pause before he spoke his brother's name. She would learn it over a winter of estate correspondence that became something more than correspondence. Over a spring morning when he came to Thornfield to discuss the Ardent mortgage with her directly, and stayed 4 hours longer than the mortgage required, over the afternoon in June, when they walked the lower farmland in silence. And he said, without preamble, "My brother would have found you formidable." And she understood it as the most intimate thing he had yet offered. On the October lane, in the cold morning, she did not know any of this. She knew only that he was looking at her, and that she was looking back, and that the brown cloak she was wearing was not, in his eyes, a disguise that had worked. He had seen her in it before she had removed it. He had been watching before she knew there was anything to watch. "Marjorie," he said. Her name, full and deliberate, the first time he had ever said it. She held very still. "The estate documents," he said, "will need to be reviewed, now that the claim is discharged. There are questions about the entail that a solicitor should address before they become complications. My own solicitor has some knowledge of comparable situations. If you were agreeable, I could arrange a consultation." It was practical. It was measured. It was the kind of thing that a neighbor with relevant knowledge offered to another neighbor, and it meant nothing at all. And it meant everything. And she was 24 years old, and she had managed 700 acres for 3 years, and she knew the difference between a man who was being kind because he could afford to be, and a man who was being careful because the thing he was handling mattered to him. "I would be agreeable to that," she said. He nodded. He looked at her for one more moment, and in that moment the October light caught the side of his face, and she saw, very briefly, the thing he did not show in public rooms, which was not the mask of composure, but the material beneath it. Careful, and worn, and held with great attention. And she thought that she understood him well enough to know how rare it was that he let anyone this close to seeing it. "Then I will call on you," he said. "On Thursday." "Thursday," she said. He went back toward the village. She stood on the lane and watched him go, and the brown cloak hung from her shoulders in the cold air, and the morning was exactly as it had been an hour before, gray stone and wood smoke, and her own breath visible. And she was, for the first time since her father's death, not afraid of what Thursday would bring. The solicitor's consultation took place on a Thursday in late October in the Thornfield drawing room, with a good fire and 3 chairs arranged around the small table, and Marjorie's account ledgers stacked on the side table where they had always been. The solicitor was a careful man named Mr. Draper, who arrived in the Earl's carriage and sat across from Marjorie with a measured professional respect that she thought had probably been established before he arrived, because it was very exact. They discussed the entail. They discussed the remaining mortgage. They discussed the tenant fund, which Mr. Draper examined with his eyeglass and his ledger, and which he subsequently pronounced sound in the particular way that means better than expected. The Earl did not speak often during the consultation. He sat in the third chair and watched the fire, and occasionally asked a question of Mr. Draper that was precise in the way his questions always were, and once, when Marjorie corrected a figure in her own account and offered the corrected number with the supporting entry, he looked at her with the expression that was not quite amusement, and had by that point become, to her, as identifiable as his profile. Mr. Draper departed at 4 p.m. The Earl did not follow immediately. They sat in the drawing-room with the fire settling and the light going outside the tall windows. And Marjorie thought, precisely, and without flinching, that she was sitting in her own house, in her own drawing-room, with a man she was beginning to understand in the way that was not general and not abstract, and that the only honest response to that understanding was to let it be what it was. "The accounts are sound," he said. "They were always sound," she said. "Yes," he said. "They were." He looked at the fire. "I want to say something to you that may be unwelcome." "Then say it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing the words with the same precision he applied to everything. "I did not request the mortgage records from Ardent on a neighbor's impulse," he said. "I requested them because the hearing had been set, and I did not know whether anyone else would bring evidence, and I was not willing to see the proceedings go without it." She waited. "I have not known what to do with that," he said, which was as close as he had come, in her experience of him, to acknowledging that there was anything he did not know. "It is not my nature to act without having considered the consequences fully. I have not been able to consider them fully." "What consequences?" she said. "Concern you." He turned from the fire and looked at her. The light from the window was failing, and the fire was behind him, and she could see his face clearly in the particular quality of light that a fire makes when the daylight gives way to it, which is the warmest and most honest light available in a drawing-room in October. "That I could not be certain," he said, "that what I wished to offer was what you wished to receive." It was the most careful thing anyone had ever said to her. She sat with it for a moment. "I have been managing alone," she said, "for 3 years." "I know," he said. "I did not learn to need assistance," she said. "I am not certain I know how to receive it." "I did not offer assistance," he said. "I offered evidence." "There is a difference," she said, "that I am still determining." "Take the time you need," he said. She looked at him, full on, the way he so often looked at her, and she let the room be quiet around them. And then she said, in the voice she reserved for things that were entirely true, "Thursday was useful. I would not object to another Thursday." His face did not change, in the way that his face never changed, but something behind it shifted, very slightly, in the direction of something warmer, and she recognized it because she had learned, slowly, to read what he did not say. "Then I will come again," he said, "on Thursday." He came on 6 Thursdays in sequence, and by the 5th, the consultation with Mr. Draper was complete, and there was no longer a practical reason for him to be there, and he came anyway. And they sat in the drawing-room with the fire and talked about the lower farmland, and the Ardent mortgage, and the tenant fund. And then they talked about other things. And the fire settled, and the evening came on, and it was December before either of them named what the Thursdays had become. He named it, in the end. It was his nature to be precise, and imprecision in something of this weight seemed to him a kind of dishonesty. he was not willing to practice. He stood in the Thornfield entry hall, hat in hand, the December dark behind him and the candle on the table between them, and he said, "I would like, Marjorie, to speak with you about whether what I feel is something you are able to return." She looked at him in the candlelight. "Yes," she said. He was still for a moment. Then, in the measured way that was entirely his, he reached for her hand and held it, her fingers in his, her glove against his glove, and they stood in the entry hall with the cold outside and the candle between them. And she understood that this was what it felt like when the weight, finally, was shared. By spring they were engaged, announced quietly, without a formal occasion, in a letter from the Earl of Harwick to Lady Fordham that made its way through the county in the way that such letters do, and which Lady Fordham read aloud at her morning call with a satisfaction that was not purely social, because she was a woman who recognized a deserved outcome when it arrived. Aldous said nothing, publicly. Privately, he reorganized his expectations toward a smaller property in Lincolnshire, and the Thornfield accounts, fully documented, passed to the care of Mr. Draper's office, where they remained in good order. Mrs. Holt called on Marjorie in April with congratulations and a basket of seed cake, because she had brought bad news once and believed in symmetry. The brown cloak was returned to the scullery peg at Thornfield on the morning after the hearing. Marjorie had folded it carefully before she placed it back, smoothing the rough wool against her palm, because it had done her a service, and she did not forget services rendered. She took it down once more, on the morning of her wedding in June, before the carriage came. She held it for a moment in the light from the east window, the color of it, the shapelessness that had made her invisible, and she thought of the 2 guards who had not looked at her, and the magistrate's hall, and the October lane, and the first Thursday, and all the Thursdays after, and then she folded it again, and placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, where it would stay. She did not need to disappear any more. She was in the carriage with her gloves fastened and her hair dressed when the Earl arrived at Thornfield's front door. He looked up at her in the carriage window, and whatever he had been about to say, he did not say, because she met his eyes through the glass, and the morning light caught her face. And he looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, with the whole of his attention, and she held his gaze without flinching. "Ready," she said. He offered her his hand when she descended. She took it. "Thank you for staying with Marjorie until the end. If her story found you, leave a word in the quiet of your own evening, and know that someone will hear it." The rosewood writing box sat on the Caldmore study table for the rest of that year and the years after. The false-bottomed panel still opened when you pressed the lower left corner and then the upper right, and inside it was the letter that had preserved her, and a pressed sprig of hawthorn from the lower farmland. On the first Thursday the accounts were declared sound, and a small folded note in a hand that was precise and deliberate and unmistakably his, which said only her name and which she had placed there herself. That note had been written on the 6th Thursday, when the fire had nearly gone, and the winter dark had pressed itself fully against the drawing-room windows, and they had both run out of practical reasons to continue the conversation. He had written it at the writing desk in the corner, with Marjorie's pen and Marjorie's ink, and he had folded it and placed it in the writing box himself, and she had understood that he was naming something that had no practical justification and did not require one. She had not known, in the summer before her father died, that she would love a man the way she loved the accounting. This was not a comparison she would have made aloud, but inwardly she understood it as a compliment of the highest order, because what she loved about the accounting was its honesty. A figure was what a figure was. The record could not lie, and if it appeared to lie, you searched until you found the error. And the error was always there, and you corrected it, and the record was whole again. She had not believed that a person could work that way, not because she was pessimistic, but because she had observed enough persons by the age of 24 to understand that most people preferred the appearance of a thing to its substance. The Earl of Harwick was a substance man. She had known this before she knew him well, in the way you know some things by a quality of observation they cannot help producing. And the winter's Thursdays had confirmed it at every particular. He told her about his brother in February, by the fire in the Thornfield drawing room, in a voice that was steady because he had learned, over 4 years, to be steady about it, though the steadiness had cost him. He told her that Henry had been 38 and married and the father of 2 small children, and that the wet road on the riding afternoon had been Richard's suggestion, and that he had replayed the suggestion so many times in the years since that it had worn a particular groove in him, not the groove of guilt precisely, though guilt was part of it, but the groove of a question that had no answerable form, which was whether he was the kind of man who carried the people in his care carefully enough. He had not, she understood then, been cold. He had been frightened of himself, which was a different thing entirely. She had not said this to him in February. She had sat with the fire and listened, and when he was done, she had said, in the voice she reserved for true things, that she thought a man who considered the question was likely to have answered it already, and that the answer was probably visible to everyone except him. He had looked at her for a long time after that. Then he had said, in the careful voice, "You do not offer reassurance lightly." "No," she said, "I do not." "Then I will take it," he said, as accurate. It was the first time, she thought afterward, that she had seen him put something down. The watching he did was still present, and the stillness was still there. But there was something behind his eyes, in the February firelight, that had the quality of a room aired after a long winter, the specific freshness of something opened that had been sealed. She had felt it in her own chest, the response to seeing it, and she had pressed her hands together in her lap and let the feeling be what it was. The April morning when he asked her formally in the Thornfield garden, with the hawthorn in bloom along the lower wall and the smell of the wet earth from last night's rain on the flagstones, had been an event prepared for by so many previous events that the asking itself was almost quiet. He had said her name, and then he had said what he wished to ask. And she had said yes. And he had taken her hands in both of his, her fingers bare of gloves for once because she had been cutting back the hawthorn when he arrived, and the pressure of his hands was warm and deliberate and entirely without theatrics, and she had thought that this was what it felt like when a thing was simply right. Lady Fordham's morning call in late April had been the occasion for a careful and comprehensive piece of social accounting, in which Lady Fordham noted that she had always thought the Earl of Harwick a man of perception, that his handling of the hearing evidence had been exceptionally considerate, and that she hoped Miss Neville understood how seldom such perception appeared in the county, or indeed in the world. "I understand it well," Marjorie had said. "Good," Lady Fordham had said, with the satisfaction of a woman who felt that the matter had been correctly resolved on all counts. Mrs. Holt had brought the seed cake and the congratulations, and had also brought, in the frank manner she could not suppress, even when she wished to, the information that Aldous had told the county that he had always thought highly of his cousin Marjorie's capabilities, and had hoped she would find a suitable situation. Mrs. Holt delivered this with an expression that suggested she found it noteworthy, and Marjorie said that she was glad Aldous had formed that opinion, and Mrs. Holt went home with the seed cake plate and the strong impression that Miss Neville, soon to be the Countess of Harwick, had not changed in any way that mattered. She had not. She was the same woman who had managed 700 acres on careful arithmetic and quiet determination, and she would bring those qualities into a household of 12,000 acres with the same attention to the record, the same care for what the figures actually said. She would also bring the writing box. It sat at the Caldmore study table by August, the rosewood panel fitted into its place, the letter from Aldous inside it, and the hawthorn and the note. She added to it that summer a careful inventory of small things, each placed deliberately, each meaning what she needed it to mean in her own private ledger. A receipt from Mr. Ardent, marked paid in full, dated the September after the engagement was announced, when the Thornfield mortgage reached its retirement. A note from Mrs. Pemberton, the farm wife who had turned to look at her in the gallery, which said only that the lower fields had come in well this harvest, and the Thornfield tenants sent their good wishes. The writing box was not the official record. The official record was elsewhere, in Mr. Draper's ledgers and the county deeds and the Harwick steward's accounts. The writing box was the record she kept for herself of the things the official record did not capture, which were the things that mattered most.